except where I'm going to show you today. So this is an interactive webinar. I am going to ask you to partake and answer questions as I go through. I may well do some polls while I'm going through as well, which you need to vote on. But this is about learning for you. I'm not here to give you anything other than the education you're looking for. This is a project. A project for me is to make sure that people understand the difference between planning and licensing. They understand the risk they run if they don't understand, and I hope that you will find the way to get educated or employ professionals to help you do what you need to do. The other thing I must point out is that when you commit an offence, knowingly or otherwise, it is a criminal act, and the law that deals with it is criminal. And when the prosecutor writes to you, communicates with you, they are prosecuting you, and they have a vested interest not to give you anything they want to give you that could help you. If a policeman was to write to you, or the police were to write to you accusing you of a crime for which you think you are innocent, they have a vested interest not to give you good advice. They are the prosecutor. So please, 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 if you're receiving anything, planning enforcement notices or civil penalty notices or notice of intended prosecution, you should call a firm that can help you solve that. Okay, so moving forward. So I'm Des Taylor. I have masses of experience in HMOs. I was born in an HMO. I've run HMOs. I've lived in HMOs, and I've developed HMOs. And I'm specifically going to talk about HMOs. Many of you will talk, may be interested about serviced accommodation. That is also another planning issue, but I'm not going to be covering that today. All right. So with no further ado, let's get started. So what I'm going to talk about first of all is I'm going to take away that confusion with regards to licensing. So HMO licenses are controlled by environmental health. Now, environmental health deals with space, heat, cold, danger, etc. Planning is not HMO licenses. They actually, the only thing that really comes close to them being crossing over is when it comes to the numbers of people and use, and I'll come on to that. So as it says there, gas and electric both heat houses, but they are two very, very different things. And you know what happens when you connect electricity with water or gas with water. You know, if you use water with electricity, you can use water to create electricity, you can use water with electricity, and it completely and utterly can cause damage, danger, and kill. So in the same way, and all these different things can combine, it's the same with housing. So licensing and management regulations are covered by environmental health, and generally under HMO, an additional and selective mandatory licensing, that comes under the Housing Acts Part 2 and Part 3. Article 4 and planning, that comes under the Town and Country Planning Acts. This is about how it's used. This is how you plan a town. This is how you'll have roads. This is where things are zoned. What's going to be retail? What's going to be commercial, industrial? What's going to be residential? What's going to be the combination of that? Where are the leisure facilities going to be? Where are the parks going to be? What greenery is going to be there? That's what this is really, really about. Okay? It's not anything, absolutely anything to do with the environment, although it may seem to. Now, in housing and planning, there are various what they call use classes. Now, there are lots and lots of other use classes other than the ones that are there, but I'm only going to use the ones that are relevant to us today. So C1 is about hotels and guest houses. The reason I bring that in is many people want to run Airbnb types in their house. They want to do it room by room, etc. They want to change their properties into all ensuite HMOs, and then they want to rent them out for short periods of time. If there's a significant change of use, that would come under planning. So although you might get a license on that property for an HMO, but you might run it more like a commercial bed and breakfast, well, you'd need to talk to the local authority about licensing, whether you've got the right license as well, because there's a lot of confusion in the local authority, and each has their own opinion as to whether an HMO licensed property can be used in a hotel guest house type scenario. And the law isn't absolutely clear and you will get differences of opinion. The most important thing is you don't want to be prosecuted by your local authority. Now, the house we live in, whether that's a flat, whether that's a large semi-detached or a large detached house or a terraced house, the use class is called residential. That is C3. Now, there are subclasses to C3, which I'm going to deal with today, so not complicate things. I'm going to deal with today. C3 residential is generally families living together. There are things to do with carers, etc. And they're also in the next class, C4, which I'm going to go into the history of that a little bit later. In C4, this is houses in multiple occupation. Now, houses in multiple occupation, this was defined in the Housing Act 2004 under section 254 and 257. And an occupant was defined under section 258 of the Housing Act. And that all comes under environmental generally. But the C4 class was introduced in 2010. I'm going to come on to that and what that planning permission is about. And sui generis means it's not classified. And so you can, so they've used one. What you have here is it's called a large HMO. So that's 7 occupants or more. And you will need that planning class in Article 4 direction areas. So you could get for 7, or you could have C4, house in multiple occupation 3 to 6. Now I said occupation, not tenants. It's not house in multiple tenancies. People say, oh, just one tenancy. Well, that doesn't count. No, it's got nothing to do with the tenancy agreement. So what Article 4 does is it removes the permitted development rights, and I will come on to that later. And for those of you, I know the questions, I've already questions coming in about serviced accommodation, so I've included that there. London, the London boroughs, the 33 London boroughs, including the City of London, they have a 90-day rule which permits short-term letting to a maximum of 90 days per year. So that is also being enforced by the likes of Airbnb, but that's not what we're talking about today. We're talking about houses in multiple occupation. Okay, so let's talk about the timeline of the C4 planning. So in April 2010, the government introduced the C4 or HMO class of use in residential properties. And that extended to any property where 2 households and 3 occupants came together, which was defined in the Housing Act 2004. But in April 2010, in order to control the expansion of houses in multiple occupation, which I will come on to the reasoning behind it, that was introduced in April 2010. In October 2010, 6 months later, David Cameron, God bless him, decided to allow people to be able to extend properties without needing to go into put extensions on houses within some permitted parameters, and they created something called the General Permitted Development Rights, which many people call PD or PDR. And under that C4, the planning use for a property which was residential to become a house in multiple occupation, C4, that we were allowed to change between C3 residential to a house in multiple occupation, or a house in multiple occupation back to a residential property without needing any planning permission. But what Article 4 does is it removes that right to do that at will. Okay, so I'm sure there'll be questions on that. I'm going to do questions at the end. There's some questions coming through. Now, the next thing that you've got to be very aware of is in the Housing and Planning Act 2016, this covered crimes, and I'm going to call them crimes or offences under the Housing Act and the Planning Acts. And a civil penalty was something that could be issued by the local council as an alternative to prosecution. So this was taking what we've done very, very well with motoring offences and saying, look, if you want to plead that guilty, but you don't actually want to be prosecuted, the alternative is we'll give you a fixed penalty notice and you just pay an amount of money, and that will be, it will be marked down against you, but it won't be a prosecution in the court where you'll have to go and be judged. You can more or less convict yourself, and that's exactly what they did here. Now, under planning, there was only one area that they covered, which I'm going to come on to shortly. But what is Article 4? As I said, it removed the general permitted development rights. So if I now want to change a house in an Article 4 area from a residential house, say 3 bedrooms, and I want to change it to an HMO, where I'm going to, and so in order to do that, I would now need to apply for planning permission. Is that clear? If Article 4 exists and I want to create an HMO, I need to apply for planning permission. If that's clear, can you put the letter C in the question box, please? Great, fantastic. Now, the original purpose of Article 4 directions was about conservation. It was about looking after old traditional buildings, arboretums, parks, etc. What it's been used to do in HMOs was it was to restrict the development of HMOs. HMOs was just one part. And normally a council will restrict that to a given geography in the area. So in some councils, the Article 4 direction only relates to certain streets, certain neighbourhoods, certain mapped out geographical areas. But in some councils, it's blanket across the council. Absolutely blanket. Okay. So what was its purpose? Why was it, what was the design and purpose of Article 4? Well, as you can see there, it was to stop overdevelopment. So in effect, overdevelopment is to conserve what we already have. So that's why it sits in this area that was originally used most of the time under conservation. We want to keep things as they were. The other thing was that in some areas of the country, there were a lot of HMOs with people who don't behave themselves, or people were coming with many vehicles, and things were getting out of control with the rubbish. But since 2016, rubbish has come under licensing under the change in the HMO rules in 2018. On the 1st of October, landlords became responsible for the control of refuse, rubbish and recycling at houses in multiple occupation. So as you can see already, some of the planning stuff, and it's very, very easy for people to get confused, planning gets talked about, but then some of the planning that's out there also gets taken away and enforced through licensing. Okay, but generally they wanted to stop antisocial behaviour, to houses and rows of houses of HMOs. But what they also wanted to do was improve HMO standards. Now, it didn't really do that, and I'll come on to that in a moment. The other thing was it wanted to attract investment to the area, and many of the, I think Lord Best said it earlier this week at the Conference of Licensed Conveyancers. He said for the first time ever, many MPs have become aware, as their children have gone to university, they've become aware of the private rented sector as they never had done before. And many of the members of the House of Lords, who are generally the third generation people, are much older, many of their grandchildren have become into the private rented sector as the getting onto the housing ladder has become harder and harder for them. So because they can't go and buy a property and save a deposit and live in that property quickly, many of them have gone into the rented sector. Parliament has become very, very aware of it. And of course, with no experience and no understanding and taking advice from maybe people who are not working in the sector, they have made some decisions. But they thought that would attract investment. They thought it would attract incoming visitors. In effect, it hasn't probably done that, but it has probably conserved some areas. So what are the implications for you? As I said earlier, and you all said you've got clearly, planning permission is needed if 3 people share in a property. That's any property. And now 3 people is from 2 households and 3 occupants. So you could have a couple married and the brother comes along to stay of one of them. That's still 1 household. So it doesn't need an HMO license, and it doesn't need any planning permission in an Article 4 area because they're family. But let's say a couple and their friend comes to live with them, and their friend's living with them. Now you've got 3 occupants from 2 households. An HMO has been formed under the Housing Act 2004, and in an Article 4 area, you have to go through the planning process. You would have to go, first of all, most people would go for a pre-application, and then it would be time for the planning application to be done. Now, it seems absolutely crazy, but for you letting agents out there, people, sharers are coming. If Article 4 is coming into your area, your landlord has to go and get planning permission. So though many of you agents who are on here, this may not be something you've considered as important before, because maybe it wasn't even on your radar. Yes, licensing you get, but what about planning? Yeah. Now, planning infringements are criminal offences, and with the other thing with planning, when you apply for planning permission, the process is a long process, and notifications go out to all your neighbours. And if the neighbours object, because most misunderstand it and think it's low-level social housing coming in who are going to cause trouble, they could object, and you've got another problem on your hands. But the councils, how did they see this? Why did they bring Article 4? They see it as shaping the communities. Now, shaping the communities, there have been people in the past, and there have been people who've run countries who've tried to shape the communities. Some have been good, some have been bad, but what it allows the council to do is for them to decide what their vision is, and then say, we're going to stop you doing this because it stops us having our vision. We're going to allow you to do that. Now, has it worked in some areas with gentrification? Yes. Has it worked in some areas where it's removed people who shouldn't be living in that area, people that we wouldn't want our children to play with or our children to grow up and be like? Yes, some of those, that it has cleaned up some of those areas, but there are many, many other social considerations, and you only got to think about how ghettos get formed, how types of people or types of communities come. Now, one of the biggest, when I was a child, one of the biggest things as you grew up is people go, oh, let's go to Chinatown. Now, Chinatown became Chinatown because lots of Chinese people went there. Now, governments don't particularly want communities coming like that. They want communities in to integrate, and the local governments want communities to integrate with all different types of people, rather than to create lots of people from European countries or from from African countries or South American countries. Now, before they can do this, they have to go through a consultation. And the reason I want you to be aware of this is if your consultation is being done in your area, you need to make representation. Otherwise, what you get you will have had no control or no influence over, and you can't then say, well, I'm going to complain about this is bad, because you didn't make any inputs. And I believe going forward, as we've seen in Liverpool earlier this month, the government stopped them doing their licensing program, a blanket licensing program. So the Minister for Communities and Local Government is going to start looking at these consultations and stop the council's blanket powers as we go forward. So another reason for you being here is to know that if you can represent, if you can make representations, you should. After the consultations, there is a commencement date, which is normally between 6 and 9 months. They can be shorter, but generally there's a set time. And the moment it commences, enforcement can start. But the main thing for the council, as many landlords would say, is this is a very good way to earn money. It's become the new parking ticket. It's become the new parking ticket. Okay, so just to see who's engaged and who knows what's going on and you've done anything, yeah, I'm going to ask you a question. Okay, it's an Article 4 direction for an HMO is when, and I've launched a poll which should be coming onto your screens now. So if you could start answering, Article 4 for an HMO is when? Is it when the council introduces HMO additional licensing? Can you all see that? Can you see the poll as it come up on the screen? Okay, let's see it again. All right, so you should be able to see it now. Sorry, that's my fault. HMO Article direction is when the council introduces additional HMO licensing. It's selective licensing. It's when you apply for planning permission, or it's the removal of permitted development rights. Could you vote now, please? Okay, it doesn't seem like that's voted. Okay, won't worry about that. Okay, the answer to that is the removal of permitted development rights. Okay, so I don't know what you can see on your screen. Right, so some stuff came up there. Okay. Right, so the poll hasn't worked particularly well. All right, not to worry. Okay, so landlords, what's their issue with what is their issue with Article 4? Well, if I own a property, I'd like to be able to do with it as I wish. I'd like to be able to do things as I feel. But what this does, it limits what he can do. The council's expected it to improve standards, but it hasn't done that at all. Actually, all it's done is prevent people getting into the market in certain areas and stop people buying properties and turning them into HMOs. And as it says there, the roads are still operating. There are councils in London where openly I'm finding out that the landlords are operating with portfolios of hundreds of properties and they're still ignoring it like the mafioso. And the council must know about this, but are doing nothing. Because the people who are doing these bad things, they're probably, to nail them on everything and to get the best, they're trying to get all of their properties. And there are many, many, many landlords who are still being rogue landlords. Don't be one of those. But at the moment, it is currently, for most landlords, this is bureaucracy, it's a source of revenue, and they don't like it. So that leads us to what's the government been doing about it? And I mentioned this earlier, the Housing and Planning Act 2016. Now, the only part that planning brings is when the council puts a banning order. And the council could put a banning order because you didn't follow a planning enforcement notice. And I'm going to come on to planning enforcement notices in a moment. But the Act of also created a database of rogue landlords which are maintained by local authorities. Now, Sadiq Khan in London has decided to publish that database, which he's allowed to do. So yes, if you get a civil penalty or a penalty enforcement notice or a taken to court, you will go on the database of rogue landlords. But the thing about the penalty enforcement notices in this act, it allowed the councils to not need to go to court to start enforcement or to fine you. So they've become the judge and the jury. Yeah. So let me talk about those planning enforcement notices, because when they come, that's not when you call the council, it's not when you write to them, that's when you call a firm that deals with defending landlords. Okay. Because the council, they will issue the notice, as it says there, because they believe a significant change of use or works have taken place at a property without planning permission. And they would like it reversed, modified, or retrospective planning permission put in. Now, when it comes to Article 4, they don't tend to want to put these applications in afterwards, which is called retrospective planning. Also, they could ban you, and you could get a breach of planning and get a banning order, which would then get that civil penalty. But the most important thing is you will also be under the proceeds of crime enforcement. So the government and the local authority will come and seize goods and anything that you have in order to recover any money that you might have made. But this is the bit that you need to be really, really, really confident about, is that there's no court. The councils have the power to be police, judge and jury. And this bit here, you're guilty until proven innocent. The only true defense is to be prepared and not be guilty. Now, this type of stuff you won't find this on council websites. Okay, so some key things for you to remember. Ignorance is no defense. Civil penalties are real. Planning has power. The housing regulations change regularly. And you mustn't abdicate responsibility. Okay. So let me ask you a question. I'm going to launch a poll. It should come up on the right-hand side on your screens. You need to apply for planning permission when Article 4 exists, when I apply for an HMO license, or when I make an offer on a property. Can you see the poll? Great, excellent. A few more still to vote. Still a few more to vote. Okay. Now, half of you haven't voted yet. Go on. Come on. Close down those other windows and participate. Right. Wow. Thank you very much for participating. Great. All right. So the most important thing is that I want you to now write in the question box when I ask the question, when you came onto this and about Article 4, did you have some belief? If you had a belief that it had something to do with licensing as well, put the letter Y for yes in there. And if you were absolutely certain it had nothing to do with it, but you wanted to find out more, put the letter N for no. Put that in the question box. I've got lots of questions. I will answer those at the end. So in the question box, if you believed Article 4 had something to do with licensing before you came on this, put the letter N in the question box. Nothing to do with the poll now. We've moved on for the poll. Great. Okay, that's interesting. All right, fantastic. Okay, now some of you are saying you couldn't see the presentation, but I didn't know why. But you didn't tell me for 24 minutes. Okay, all right, but absolutely fantastic. All right, so a couple of other things. What can you do in this situation that we're in today? Okay, when Article 4 exists, you must buy stock, housing stock, or invest in HMO stock that is already available. Now, a lot of HMO stock is sitting empty in areas where universities have been building student accommodation. So lots of places like Southampton, this has been happening, Bristol, this has been happening. So there's lots and lots of HMOs have been sitting empty because they haven't been picked up on the next student rounds. Now, they've started looking to fill the student accommodation for September in January. So if you're looking to buy HMOs or rent HMOs and do a rent-to-rent situation, then that's something that you'll probably see around March time is a very, very good opportunity. If you're going to buy or rent, you should offer subject to planning permission. Do not part with your money until you've got the planning permission in place. Do not exchange contracts until you've got the planning permission in place. But you can also buy in Article 4 areas. So if it already exists and it already is Article 4 and it's already proven and has a certificate of lawfulness, then you can buy that HMO because it's existing HMO stock. Or you can buy in Article 4 areas where licensing is coming, Article 4 is coming in, such as Birmingham, which is later this year, Lewisham's coming in March. You could buy something and turn it into an HMO immediately, but you have to do that before the date Article 4 comes in. So do know your areas. Don't get confused with licensing, because many additional licensing areas do become Article 4 areas. What's the approach to take here? Well, before that we do that, let me ask you one more question. An HMO with 8 occupants, it needs planning permission and an HMO license, an HMO license only, or planning permission only? Just launching that now. Could everybody please answer this question, because this is really, really important to see if you've got this. An HMO with 8 occupants needs planning permission and an HMO license, an HMO license or planning permission only. Wow. All right. So all of you who wrote HMO license only, I would suggest that you listen to the recording. So when the webinar has finished, you will receive a recording, and please listen to the recording again. The right answer is planning permission and an HMO license. Now, I haven't covered licensing in this, and if you want a copy of the licensing webinar that I did last week, so you can understand that, please do drop me an email at help@landlordsdefence.co.uk, and I will send you the link for that recording. 90% of you got that right. It is planning permission and an HMO license. You need planning permission because it's more that it's the seven occupants or more for an HMO requires planning permission. That's blanket across the country. That is the law. And a house where there are 5 occupants in an HMO from 2 households, it wouldn't be an HMO if they were all one family, so it's an HMO, would also need a license. That is mandatory, and that's the law. So the 10% of you who got that wrong, which is a shame, yeah, it's a shame. It's really, really important you get this right, okay? Now, if you send me an email, that'd be absolutely fantastic. If you've got a mobile number already, then WhatsApp me. And please, if you've got my mobile number, please do not be sharing it with people without my permission. I would ask. A lot of people come to me looking for free advice at 9 and 10 o'clock at night when I'm with my family. My family means everything to me, so please, I would prefer that you didn't. So what's the right approach here? 1, you've got to know this stuff. So I'm glad that some of you have learned today, 90% of you. You've got to do it. To know and not to do is not to know. I don't know who said that saying, but I do like it. Okay, you've got to do it. If you don't do it, you will get caught. Knowing the consequences. Councils, where they believe illegal HMOs are running either planning and licensing, or planning on its own or licensing on its own, are doing dawn raids. I published a link last week from somewhere very close to where I live, where the owner of 10 properties which were not being run properly as HMOs, breach of management regulations and planning, where they did a dawn raid with the police, planning, licensing, building regulations, and social services. Yeah, so massive. If you're going to go and get advice, I say seek top advice. I'm going to be quite frank with you. I would say in the whole country, there is probably only 50 people who know all of this stuff exactly as I do. There's probably 6 people on Facebook who really do understand it, and that includes famous developers, famous landlords, whatever you want to call them. Yeah, and those that do understand it is because they've worked with professionals. So seek top advice. But the most important thing is thoroughness. Absolute thoroughness. And I was pleased to see some lads on YouTube the other day were doing a video of their journey in something called Rent to Rent, and they got to the point where they really, I would suggest 25% of the video of what they'd done was all about the compliance, meeting the regulations of planning permission, meeting the regulations of management, meeting the regulations of licensing, and making sure they had the right agreement that was fair and reasonable between them and the landlord. It was absolutely fantastic to see, and quite gratifying to see, because so many people just move forward without understanding the consequences. And every single day, things come through and I go, wow, what's the problem? Why is that happening, etc. And it's because people have lack of understanding. Okay, so the right approach, as you can see there on the screen, I'm hoping, know your stuff, do it, know the consequences, seek top advice, and thoroughness. So now I'm going to go on to questions. For those of you who need to get in touch, there's some information there. So I'm going to talk about questions. So I'm going to open up to questions. So in the question box where you've been writing at the beginning, when you wrote 11 and 12, etc., that's where you need to type now. I'm going to go through some of the questions that are there. Now I can see the presentation. Would it be too hard to set up an HMO in Article 4 area in Liverpool now? If there's Article 4 in Liverpool, you would absolutely need to apply for planning permission. The fastest way to do that is to do what they call a pre-app. Now that will cost you maybe 150, 200 pounds, depending on what the price is from the people in the council. Go look on their website, do a pre-app, or ask for an opinion. They'll have a fee for doing that. The picture, yeah, that picture is one of the HMOs that I developed. That was a 3-bedroom house. We converted it into 6 HMO rooms, and we let that for about 2 months on Airbnb because there was massive demand, and the standard we did was like that. And And at the end of the day, the place was absolutely fantastic, and we sold it because it was a development. We had it. The reason we put it on Airbnb was we had a bridge on the property, so we needed to make that. We need to continue paying that. I'm thinking of converting a hotel into an HMO, 21 bedrooms. How many kitchens are required in a large HMO? It's a fantastic question. And the question as to how many kitchens you need, there's 3 things to consider. First of all, planning. When you put your planning application in, there will be standards in planning for HMOs in your local authority. Now, 1 kitchen for every 5 people is the norm. Yeah, so now that's a rule of thumb that we use. They'll be different with different places and different sizes, and the size of the kitchen and all of those things will need to be taken into consideration under planning. Because you're creating a new HMO, you will have to comply with planning. You will also, for that hotel, because the kitchens are probably already there, if you've got 21 bedrooms, you will also need licensing for 21, and you'll need to follow the council's amenity standards for that. Now, the bedroom sizes, the amenity standards, some of those standards may be aspirational, and if they are aspirational, you'll need to fight them. The problem that you have, and I'm working a big case right now with a landlord, he's got a large number of properties, and he's done some work, and he's got the planning, and the planning's fine, but the licensing part is having some problems, and he's needing to fight that because you've got 2 different departments at different loggerheads with one another. So it's very, very, very important that you get professional help. And I will tell you now, your planning consultant cannot advise you on licensing properly. Your licensing consultant can't advise you on planning properly. Your environmental consultant or your architect can't always advise you on everything properly. Your environmental health officer may not be able to advise you on everything properly. What you need is to have a consultation about that conversion you're doing with a firm like Landlords Licensing and Defence or similar, who fully understand and work and fight these cases on a daily basis, so that you don't commit a crime or an offence when you start operating. Okay? And if you're building and you haven't got the planning right, or you go against the planning, the plans you put in, then you'll also have some issues there. Now, the next question, if that hasn't answered your question fully, please ask more questions or get in touch with me directly. You do know that a pre-app is not legally binding. Yes, of course I do. Absolutely. A pre-app is just the advice and the opinion of the planning officer. And when you get the pre-app, it will say in the pre-app, it will say this is not legally binding. This is our opinion. So you do a pre-app to get an idea of if they'll go with it. But really only when you put the planning permission in will you know whether you get it. Now, it is your right as a citizen to do what you wish to do, but you do have to get planning permission for it, and you have to be prepared to, 1, slog it out, 2, you have to also understand that in that road or that area there may be covenants. So even though you've achieved planning permission, you would have to check that there aren't covenants. So I know this because at the back of my sister's house, they wanted to build a massive hotel, and they got planning permission. They got everything, and everything was done, but all the neighbours said, but there's a covenant in this area that says you can't build a hotel there. And that covenant to this day, 15 years on, is still being upheld. And there are people say, oh yeah, you can get rid of that. Can you, can't you? That's down to the individual situation. Okay. Do you know what, you know, the what is the name of the YouTube channel of the Rent to Rent HMO, please? I have absolutely no idea. I have absolutely no idea what it is. It was just one I saw a link on Facebook. I saw the guys. I picked up on it. Look up Stephen Fontaine on Facebook and ask him. It'll probably be on his Facebook page. Or ask Napa Bafficelli. Napa G Bafficelli on Facebook, and they're rent to rent guys. How does additional or selective licensing affect rent to rent? The same as if you're the owner of the property. If you're doing rent to rent, additional or selective licensing. Selective licensing is about single let properties. Additional licensing is additional HMO licensing. This is a webinar about planning. If you want the link for the recording of the webinar I did about licensing, I can send that to you. Just drop me a note when you receive the email after the webinar with the recording and the follow-up. Just drop a response back, please. Could you send me the link to get the recording of the webinar for licensing? Okay. You could to outline planning, I believe. No, I don't know what that means. You could do outline planning. I'm not sure what the question means. Could you rewrite that one? That's the same person who said, do you know that a pre-app is not legally binding? I'm not here to be tested, but yeah, you can do all sorts of things. There's lots of bits and pieces. This is about Article 4 and about planning. Yes, the most important thing is if you're intending to do something, you need to get advice. I would always employ a planning consultant who is used to dealing with the bureaucracy of these things. Yeah. Okay, but yeah, if you're saying, is there outline planning? So where my father grew up in Ireland, the plot of land that he lived, the place he lived, the house he lived, has deteriorated and become a wreck, and it's deteriorated. It's just an old bricks fallen down place now, but that has outline planning permission to build a dwelling house on it. Now, outline planning permission for an HMO, that if that's what you're referring to, no, it doesn't exist in that way. No, outline plan, that's what outline planning permission is. Yeah. Pre-apps, is it always worth to do a pre-app? If you're going to make a 21 bedroom HMO, there's a lot of money you're going to need to use to make sure plans are drawn up correctly. You've dealt with all the zoning. You've dealt with all the ideas of the parking. You've dealt with all the needs for water, sewerage, etc., and utilities in the area. All of that needs to be taken into consideration, along with maybe some things to do with highways. So I would definitely put a pre-app in, and depending on where it is and what you're doing, you may have to speak to highways as well. Because when you put a planning application in, highways will be asked to comment, as will providers of utilities like water. They're very, very important. Okay, some fantastic questions. The webinar is a 45-minute webinar. We are at that point now. I did start a couple of minutes late, so I've gone over a couple of minutes over. Is there any more questions that anybody's got from me on the subject or on this matter that I'm talking about today? Okay, so there are my details. You can get hold of me there, all on the screen. Take a note of those. If you do need some help in defending yourself on licensing or on planning, or you want to get some basic information, we do offer short 15 and 20-minute consultations where we can find out a little bit about what you need and give you some advice on that. So don't be afraid to get in touch. But if you do need a full professional consultation, we do those as well. We have a team of people working with us on a daily basis, and we have a number of cases to work on. So looking forward to hearing from you. If there are no more questions, thank you very much for your participation. I've enjoyed sharing with you, and I do look forward to sharing some more with you soon. Any tips? Right, one more question. Any tips to include on an application in case of Article 4 direction? Does it help that I'm a credit landlord and want to raise standards? Yes and no, but yeah, get in touch.